Today we are talking about the book, The Science Delusion by Rupert Sheldrake. Now, I know the cult of scientism has gained ground in this sort of area among our fellows in the past couple of years, rightly so, against the various superstitions populating the Chud sphere, you might say. But I think there has been something of an excess in this direction against empirical evidence and against uh, a host of studies and documented evolutionary facts, which don't really point in a particularly mechanistic direction. And so I picked this book as being relatively easy in that direction. It is quite simple. It's in fact a little bit annoyingly simple, but that's okay because we're just here to compile facts. And it's relatively easy to kind of skim through. But at any rate, Rupert Sheldrake, a lot of people call him a quack. He's often made fun of as just kind of making things up. But the guy is a PhD biochemist from Cambridge. He did lead research at a variety of universities. He was even in direct contact with the CIA with his friend Dean Radin. Funnily enough, their work was more valued by the federal government of the United States than by their own peers because it did provide objective results rather than fitting a given narrative frame. But at any rate, he is a qualified professional, suffice to say. It's not just some guy. It's actually a guy who engaged in intensive biological and chemical research for years and came to the conclusion that the mechanistic neo-Darwinian approach to science is deeply flawed. So, at any rate, in this book, he sets forth his own unique hypothesis, or it's not really a theory, I suppose. It is quite tentative. He's very honest about it. But his idea is basically that of morphic resonance, that there is an attraction across space and time between forms. Well, let me give you an example of this, that crystals, for instance, evolve collectively, immaterially. There's evidence for rats under experimental conditions. They exhibit forms of specific collective memory, which could not be passed by merely material inheritance, but, beyond the individual population, which has been trained to the entirety of the species. And so he sees the entirety of nature as basically suffused with attractive forces, you could say, like how an atom pulls the completely supposedly random behavior of subatomic particles at the quantum level into an organized whole, thus molecules, thus obviously RNA, cells, organisms, societies, and so on, up to the level of the entire universe. He sees a nested hierarchy of wholes which attract to themselves and govern themselves as basically making up the entirety of the universe. And he sort of sees himself as a successor to Aristotle in this regard. He kind of has a historicist view maintained throughout, which is relatively unique, I think. He's a little bit unfair to Platonism. I mean, Plato wouldn't have really disagreed with any of that, famously. I mean, none of that would be opposed to Platonism, but he puts himself in an Aristotelian tradition somewhat implicitly. He makes use extensively of, he makes extensive reference of the medieval European tradition, the sort of default worldview across most civilizations being that, nobody denies the realities of the body, but the unity of organisms and of material forces is taken as emanating from some form of soul, some immaterial soul. And of course, in the Neoplatonic sense, all is taken as an emanation from the one. There isn't really this sort of atomism, you might say, of the more classical Hellenic view. But at any rate, so he places himself more in that Aristotelian camp. He sees European science as evolving from that origin, which was maintained, I might add, through the Renaissance. People tend to think of things in a not even in the tripartite ancient, medieval, modern, but in our context, just of medieval and modern. There tends to be a view that we just escaped from the Middle Ages into the Enlightenment, but into the Renaissance. These organic Aristotelian or Platonic views were maintained, especially, of course, Italian despots were famous for their fondness for Platonism. But at any rate, he sees the dualism which conditions modern science as emerging during the Enlightenment, in accord with the Christian, you could say, sort of the Christianization of Platonism, the idea of absolute mind-body dualism. Of course, this is most famously represented with Descartes, but so you see in this more so the 17th century, not in the Renaissance, but more towards the 17th century, with the revival in with the revival in religious fanaticism, you ironically see a secularization of that Christian worldview into the sciences. You do get the emergence of this dualism, rather unique in history, characteristic of Western civilization. But at any rate, this dualism was, in his view, untenable. The idea that there is a mind totally free inhabiting the brain that doesn't really bear up. If you, as soon as you remove an inherent soul, an animistic view of the universe, there really is nothing preventing you from removing the mind. If every condition of the mind is supposedly, if pleasure and pain correspond with material circumstances, why wouldn't you then abstract that to the brain? Why wouldn't you say your mental states on a more sublime level are entirely governed by material circumstances in the brain? So from this dualism, this, you could say, in the Nietzschean sense, we are obviously already Christian, but a sort of enhancement of those Christian values as against the historical faith itself, as against the Europeanized faith itself, sees this transvaluation of values even in the sciences. But at any rate, so that's sort of the basic historicism. As I said, he sees himself more Aristotelian. He sees quantum physicists as often more in the Platonic camp. They are sort of heirs to, he sees the idea of a mathematical law governing all circumstances, which he sees as a sort of variation on, the Platonic separation of the ideal from the real. I don't know if that's, again, entirely fair to Plato, but it is an interesting sort of dichotomy that he draws up. So what is this fellow's evidence for his particular thesis, his idea of morphic resonance, of the non-locality and, the general non-locality of consciousness? That means, as far as space and time is concerned, there is a degree of freedom from these circumstances, as well as the idea of morphic resonance, that members within a group, members of a species, you could say members of a race, if you wanted to be childish about it and sort of take it in our own direction. Members of even forms of crystals, as I said, why do these things evolve collectively? What is the evidence for any of this stuff? Is he just making this up? Well, I'll go through the catalog here. As I already mentioned, I should say there's various attempts to explain these things. At all times, someone will raise the finger and say, for instance, well, what if various floating particles simply were transmuted from lab to lab? What if somehow, beyond all circumstances of our capacity to measure these things, somehow one crystal went to one lab, maybe there's cross-pollination, maybe these things are merely explainable materially. His view is that that's basically impossible. We have no evidence for any of these skeptical claims. This exists in the case of lab rats as well. If you train lab rats to swim, members of the same species who were not given the same training will improve their own capacities. It's been proved in a variety of studies. He speaks of the evolutionary record itself. There's vast gaps, of course. This is the standard Christian sort of creationist argument that you don't really have a consistent gradualistic Darwinian evolutionary model. That's not disproving materialism of any form, but it is generally acknowledge that there is a dearth of evidence for the particular neo-Darwinian worldview. He lists certain occurrences biologically that should be impossible. For instance, his skepticism of the omnipotence, I should say, of DNA. So, for instance, if you sever a piece of algae, if you sever an algae into the nucleus and then the rest of it, the severed part will actually start to repair itself, even though it has no DNA. Even though, for an organism to repair itself, by definition, in order to reconstitute its prior form, it would have to have DNA. It would have to have a roadmap. That's basically the consensus, is that you need a blueprint for the organism, and that is the DNA. But a severed piece of algae without any DNA is capable of reconstructing itself. And this is the kind of guy who studied these things. He actually examined these things firsthand, and he says this should be physically impossible according to known physical laws. So he also mentions the immateriality of memory. This is one of the more interesting points, in my opinion. The fact that, I'll give an example of one scientist, Lashley. He spent 30 years trying to prove the locality of memory. In the sort of, the basic hypothesis is there's long strains of nerves in your brain winding throughout it, and that these are memories, and that if you, hypothetically, if you cut them, that would destroy the memory. This is basically what most people believe. It's just kind of the standard sitting hypothesis. But he says, or this scientist, Lashley, who sought to, prove this, he came in thinking that it was the case. Over the course of 30 years, he found absolutely zero evidence, and this has been the case universally. There is no evidence at all that memories are stored in material traces, in like these maze-like patterns that have been assumed for decades to be the case. Even Pavlov, everybody knows Pavlov. He's the materialist Marxist. You would think he'd adhere to this view, although they do tend to deny genetic determinism or whatever. But Pavlov as well said there was no evidence for this. There's no, you can remove vast portions of the brain and have almost no effect on memory at all. It more resembles if you were to damage a radio, for instance. That's what it looks like. That's the closest analogy. If you damage a radio, you get a worse signal, obviously, but you don't destroy the signal. You don't remove a portion of it. And that's the case with the brain. You can remove the vast majority of like the motor cortex, and yet, so long as, or the entirety of the hippocampus even, and yet memories that were generated in specific parts of the brain will remain there. You can see where a chick's brain was lighting up when it learned something, and then you can cut out that entire piece of the brain, and that memory will remain. So anyway, the point is these things have been investigated thoroughly. People have been looking for this constantly. They've been slicing up brains by the millimeter, and yet there is no evidence of our capacity to materially destroy memories without, just destroying the capacities of the brain itself, like you would destroy a radio, for instance, or a TV. That's the favorite analogy by, more transcendental types, is to compare the brain with a radio. Obviously, early 20th century physicists like that analogy. I'm told Mr. Contrary Pancake likes to talk about that, although I don't know as much about that myself. He also mentions how certain constants, which we take as basically the fundamental laws of the universe, have been observed to change. Now, I can't speak on this at length because, I've had a friend well-versed in physics tell me, well, if these things really did fluctuate so much, it would be impossible to land on the moon. So, how could this even happen anyway? It should be impossible. Maybe it's just faulty equipment. But I will give the arguments as he gives them. I don't know very much myself, but he says that from 1973 to 2010, there was a 1.1% variance in G. So, the gravitational force of the universe varied by 1.1%, which is absolutely insane. And this corresponded with the advancements in measuring equipment. This wasn't like, this was a progressive movement. The equipment improved, and yet the results varied more. So that shouldn't be the case at all. The difference should only be a few parts per million, and yet here it is at a whole 1.1%. Likewise, in 2002 MIT found a slight variation in G across a 23.9 hour period, which obviously would correspond to the Earth's cycle. So maybe it's just completely localized. Maybe it is the gravity of the Earth itself interfering with instruments. Who knows? But those sorts of variants should not exist at all, and yet they only get larger over time. Likewise, alpha, I don't know much about it, but I know it determines electromagnetic relations somehow. This is also another universal constant. It was first observed by John Webb to be slightly smaller at a great distance of like billions of light years. And in 2010, it was confirmed that actually, yes, it had changed from the start of the universe. That this supposedly fundamental law had changed since the origin of the universe. Likewise, and this is more keyed, I think, c, which is the speed of light, of course, dropped 20 kilometers per second from 1927 to 1945. So the hand of Kalki or something was active, I think. That's very cool. But at any rate, it did go up again from 1945 to 1972 when it was fixed by definition. So if it did vary, then we wouldn't know because it's fixed. I mean, we measure the meter by the speed of light. Now we measure the meter by the speed of light by a certain lapse of time, how far light passes. And so it would be basically impossible for us to detect if it has changed since then. And then, so his colleague, Dean Radin, if you look up some of this stuff, if you look up about randomness generators, quantum randomness generators, or random number generators, some of the first results you'll see are actually from the CIA, and it's penned by this guy, Dean Radin, his friend. And it's just up there on the CIA website. It's just right there on Google. And at any rate, this colleague of his was extensively involved in testing the effects of the supposed effects of the human mind on quantum randomness generators. So if you don't know what this is, basically at the subatomic level, I don't know a whole lot about quantum physics, but basically at the subatomic level, you predict the behavior of electrons and other subatomic particles you predict it. There's a chance. The behavior of these particles are chance. You treat them as waves, basically. And you can construct a membrane of sorts, I believe, with an electrical membrane of sorts, such that there is a 50-50 chance of an electron passing through it. So basically, it's a perfect random number generator for 0 or 1, whether the electron will pass through it. You can do this trial millions or billions of times, and it will come out 50-50 consistently. But if a human subject is told to think of either the number 0 or 1, that electron will be a couple percentage points more likely to go in that direction, which should literally be impossible. But this has been replicated all over the world in labs all over the world for decades. This isn't controversial. I mean, mentioning it is kind of taboo, but the results themselves are not at all controversial. And anyway, Dean Radin was heavily involved in this kind of thing. Princeton was heavily involved in this thing. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, which has since been closed, but was very active in its time. One of their studies, just one study, showed odds of 60 billion to 1 as to whether this was just randomly the number 1 or 0 being increased just by happenstance. Their own odds were 60 billion to 1, and that's actually relatively small. If you compile, if you were to do a meta-analysis, it'd be much greater than that. For instance, Radin did experiments on telepathy. I'll get into that in a bit. That might sound goofy to some of you, but the odds there were 300 trillion quadrillion to 1. So suffice to say, meta-analyses tend to give even more decisive results. So another fundamental claim by most neo-Darwinian scientists and some educational institutions is the idea of the total absence of free will. One experiment that was early on touted in this regard was the Libet experiment. And basically, Mr. Libet engaged subjects in a number of stimuli and recorded their cognition of those stimuli. as well as their immediate physiological reaction to them. But at any rate, he found that stimuli, or a certain stimulus, presumably not a very strong one, but if it lasted less than 500 milliseconds, it wasn't cognized at all. But if it was longer, it was cognized before the 500 millisecond mark. So it appeared as though the human mind were moving backwards in time, or somehow had precognition that the stimulus would last longer than 500 milliseconds, because, of course, it began before that point if the stimulus lasted longer. But at any rate, this experiment, ironically, specific portions of it were used by the rest of academia to bolster the idea of total determinism, because supposedly 300 milliseconds prior to a decision being made, certain patterns of behavior were observed in the brain that seemed to indicate that a decision had been made. But Libet himself had a completely different interpretation, that there was actually a 200 millisecond veto period during which the subject could refuse to interact in a certain way with the stimulus. So at any rate, that is one of the cornerstones of debunking Sheldrake and others, and yet the actual author of the paper itself would have been more on his side. Again, this is something you observe in quantum physicists. This is something even with someone like Pavlov. It's like all these great minds that are enshrined in our modern world were actually heretics by most metrics today. They would have been run out as heretics. I mean, someone like Max Planck saying that everything is mind, or that mind is primal, that sort of thing. It doesn't fit at all. But these were the geniuses who created these fields. We're living in their shadows, and yet their ideas are completely ridiculed by their impish successors. So I guess that's most of it. I could go in greater depth on Radin if anybody's interested. I haven't read his books yet. I would like to do so. But he did the telepathy experiments, where you would put someone in total sensory deprivation, no electromagnetic influence at all. He actually had them blow a Coast Guard horn in one room, and the next room was unable to hear it. So, there was zero overlap between these two rooms, and you'd have one person think about one person in total sensory deprivation, or relative sensory deprivation, and one person thinking thoughts at them, supposedly. And this consistently had a result of afterward they would have to pick one of 4 images representing the image that was projected at them. And across 8 different studies by different universities replicating Radin, and even one in the Netherlands, one in Texas, and somewhere else, done by skeptics, consistently the number about 32%, as against 25% supposed accuracy was achieved. So, that would be extremely unlikely, and demonstrates a certain possibility for telepathy. But at any rate, these connections were stated to have been weaker between random people, between people who actually knew each other well. It was much stronger. So that's what he did. Sheldrake has done similar things with telephones. I won't go on forever about that, but like people knowing who's calling them, that sort of thing. Interesting stuff. I would need to read it more in depth. I don't want to bore people with these things, but suffice to say, there's a great deal of evidence out there for non-physical means of communication. So that is my book review. If anybody has anything to add, I invite them to do so. It is recorded. It'll be up for like a day if you missed a portion of it, so you can go back. Don't worry. It's okay. If nobody is interested, I can end it, but I guess I'll just wait 1 minute. All right. Well, that was Aryan Book Club number 4. I hope you enjoyed Aryan Book Club number 4. It was very an enjoyable experience. Thank you.